Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to take you on a journey about trauma recovery with Black youth. So before we get to youth, I want you to think about babies. I want you to just think about all babies. Think about them short, fat, cute, dimpled. And I want you to think about Black babies in all of their warm hues, their sweetness and softness. And I want you to think about a universe where they aren't harmed by the violence and trauma of racism. That's the world that they deserve, but it's not the historical context that they are born into. They're born into a context that at its core is based on white supremacy, that racializes them, that distorts what their beautiful tones mean. It otherizes them. And other factors in terms of how their genders are perceived, what access to health their families have had, what they have been exposed to in terms of systemic violence. All of this has shaped and formed their hope and their vision in the world. And thankfully, so also, even though this context of systemic violence and otherizing has occurred historically and contemporarily, they also have a context of historical resistance. They have a legacy of fighting, a legacy of restoration in the middle of this dehumanization, this attempt at dehumanization. They also have the sparkle and the breadth of their creativity, their innovation, their possibility and power in the middle of. So as I look around this room full of social workers, social work researchers, educators, practitioners, I invite us to think deeply about what forms of trauma recovery strategies will support Black youth to have the futures that they deserve. What can we do that supports their well-being? So how did I get to this question? It came through my experience of also being a Black baby, a Black girl growing up in the Bronx in the 80s. Somebody must know what that means. It came with me, these questions about recovery from trauma around every corner. It came with me as I attended the schools that were under-resourced. It came with me, it traveled with me from down south, where my grandmother's from Greensboro, North Carolina. It traveled from Barbados. It traveled to Harlem, and it traveled to the Bronx. This question about what kind of trauma recovery would be meaningful to Black youth emerged out of my practice as a social worker for 19 years. The question came up every time a Black youth came into our community center after being harassed, stopped and frisked. This question came up when a young person passed too early because of mold dilapidating the apartment. It also came to me every time a Black youth protested against these very conditions. It told me that services alone weren't enough. The traumatic conditions that Black youth encounter that are interlocking required more from me as a social worker. It required that I thought deeper about the systemic violence that they were encountering and what could open up the possibilities for them having the futures and the lives that they deserved. So I had to listen. As I started to listen, I interviewed Black youth who organized against racism, against economic injustice. They were turning towards the systems that were harming them and creating the conditions for their trauma and their pain, as opposed to turning away from them. Black youth that I interviewed created a new opportunity for me to understand what trauma recovery could be. I understood from them that the role and function and meaning of organizing was much broader than I could have imagined. It meant that they could redefine destiny. They could redefine destiny. Whatever was planned for them, that wasn't the way that the ending of the story had to be, based on their own hands. 2, I learned that trauma recovery also had to exist at the mass group level. They were not individuals alone. They responded to other people's pain. They responded to other people's joy who looked just like them. They were part of a whole. And trauma recovery could no longer exist as something just for an individual. The third thing I learned was also that organizing against systemic violence meant that they were connecting to their ancestors. It meant that the legacies that they were standing on were strengthening them, preparing them for the context that they were in. As they organized, they called upon, they literally told me they were channeling the power of Harriet Tubman. They were calling in Audre Lorde. They were calling in Malcolm X. And this wasn't figuratively, this was literally feeling the power of their ancestors who fought before them, leaving a legacy behind them that they will also contribute to. That amazed me. Now, I'm not saying that organizing is a panacea, that it's a cure-all for all Black youth who have experienced systemic violence. I'm not saying that therapy is obsolete, and I'm not saying that there aren't abuses that young people experience when they organize. They encounter racism. They encounter physical threats. They encounter trolling. They encounter colorism. They encounter exploitation of their labor. They are overworked and underpaid. And they organize anyway. They organize and they fight back anyway. Because they can't afford for change to come slowly. They need to say now that something is unjust. And so a couple of examples that inspire me from Black youth as they take on the various systems. If I think about the Black Youth Project 100, I think about not only their fantastic campaigns about bailing out Black mamas, challenging draconian policies of the MTA, when people are trying to get to school, trying to get to work, and they hop a turnstile and they're incarcerated, or they're quickly caught up in a system that was always meant to harm them. Not only are they taking those actions, they're also writing articles about us. They're writing about mental health care, and they're tired of social workers and counselors telling them that they are wrong when they are anxious and worried about being harmed because they are Black. I also think about Black Lives Matter, the global movement. I think about the Healing Justice Toolkit that they created to support Black youth who are on the front lines to know how to get grounded and centered and prepared for what they might experience when they are trying to counter some of the systemic violence that they are experiencing. They created a toolkit and a space for people to reflect and think about how they can be well while they are organizing. And they also recognize that to be well, they need to organize. So where does that leave us? Look around, look at someone and say, where does that leave us? It leaves us with an opportunity. We have an opportunity in how we contemplate knowledge building. We can center the joy and the wisdom of Black youth. We can consider their practices, how they incorporate healing justice. We can actually bring that into our work when we are considering to take on a study about trauma recovery. We can also, as researchers, say, we're going to undo racism as we consider how we're going to imagine trauma recovery practices and how we're going to study them. We can no longer say that our study comprises of a majority of Black youth and not consider race as a factor or the exposure to racism as a factor for their pain. We can also collaborate with Black youth and learn and value their expertise. So in closing, as we think about what Black youth deserve and we think about our role with trauma recovery, I want us to go back to think about Black youth as babies and think about their power, what they deserve, and consider how we can be co-conspirators with their movements, how we can rally to challenge the priorities and the policies that attempt to annihilate their lives, and know that that is reimagining trauma recovery with Black youth. Thank you.